Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 32, Svyatoslav the Brave. This week I am thanking new boyars, Ed and Damien, and new State Councillor Claudio. And as always, I also thank anyone subscribing through Apple. Welcome back to Kiev, and today we are looking at Olga's successor. So let's start with a summary of what the tale of bygone years has to say about him. Svyatoslav first appears as a child, accompanying Olga to reconquer the Derevlians and starting the battle by attempting to throw a spear at them. Yes, this is foreshadowing for him growing up into a warrior. He next pops up rejecting Olga's attempts to get him to convert to Christianity, before we get a proper introduction. Quote, when Svyatoslav had grown and matured, he began to gather a numerous and valiant army. Stepping light as a leopard, he undertook many campaigns. Upon his expeditions he carried with him neither wagons nor kettles, and boiled no meat, but cut off small strips of horseflesh, game, or beef, and ate it after roasting it on the coals. Nor did he have a tent, but he spread out a horse blanket beneath him and set his saddle under his head, and all his retinue did likewise. What does that sound like? Who else lived in the saddle, hunted, and made war? We'll come back to the question of who was in Svyatoslav's army. Next, the tale says, he sent messengers to other lands, announcing his intention to attack them. It's always nice to get a bit of notice. He goes to the Vyaticians and asks them to whom they pay tribute. They say the Khazars, and Svyatoslav goes off to attack the Khazars. The Khan comes to meet him, and Svyatoslav defeats him and takes Bielovezha, that is, the fortress of Sarkel. Along the way, he apparently conquers the Yasyans and the Kasodians, and makes them and the Vyaticians his tributaries. Next is the turn of the Bulgarians. Svyatoslav defeats them and, says the tale, captures 80 towns along the Danube. He decides to live there, rules from Pereyaslavets, apparently also taking tribute from the Greeks. At this point, the Pechenegs decide to invade Rus and lay siege to Kiev, where Olga is looking after Svyatoslav's sons, Yaropolk, Oleg, and Vladimir. The people of the city are approaching starvation, with the Rus on the other side of the river unable to come to their assistance. A brave lad who spoke Pecheneg volunteers to go for help. Waving a bridle and asking if anyone's seen a runaway horse, he makes his way through the Pecheneg lines and swims across the Dnieper to tell the gathered Rus that if they do not relieve the city, the next day it will fall. The Rus leader, a man named Pritich, declared that if the city fell, Svyatoslav would kill him. So before dawn, they took to their boats and set off across the river. Still unseen in the morning mists, they began blowing their trumpets and making as much noise as possible. The Pechenegs thought that Svyatoslav had returned and fled. When the leader of the Pechenegs saw Pritich disembark and Olga come down to meet him, he went himself to greet him and asked if he was Svyatoslav. Pritich said no, he was just the vanguard for Svyatoslav's uncountable host, and the leader of the Pechenegs asked Pritich to agree to peace and friendship. The two exchanged weapons, and the Pechenegs left. This didn't last long, though. The people of Kiev sent a message to Svyatoslav complaining that while he was off gallivanting around, they were left unprotected. So he drove the Pechenegs out of the steppe and returned to his mother. But rather than settling in Kiev, he declared to his mother and the gathered boyars that, quote, I do not care to remain in Kiev, but should prefer to live in Pereyaslaviec on the Danube, since that is the center of my realm, where all the riches are concentrated. Gold, silks, wine, and various fruits from Greece, silver and horses from Hungary and Bohemia, and from Rus, furs, wax, honey, and slaves. End quote. Olga begs him to remain in Kiev until she is buried, and she dies soon after. Svyatoslav's departure to Pereyaslav creates some problems with the governance of Rus. He puts his son Yaropolk in charge in Kiev and his other son Oleg in Dereva. The people of Novgorod see this as a bit of a slight and demand a prince of their own, sending a messenger to tell him that if he doesn't come, they'll choose their own. Neither Yaropolk nor Oleg wishes to move to Novgorod, but Svyatopolk's advisor, Dobrynya, suggests his nephew, Vladimir, son of Svyatoslav and Dobrynya's sister, Malusha, who is often described as his housekeeper, but sometimes as some sort of wise woman. Svyatoslav agrees and leaves for Pereyaslav, while Vladimir and Dobrynya head for Novgorod. The problem with Pereyaslav is that the Bulgarians still think it belongs to them, and they fortify the city against him. The Bulgarians sally out and successfully attack the Rus with what is referred to in the tale as great carnage. But Svyatoslav rallies his men, turns the tide, and they take the city by storm. He then writes to the Byzantines to tell them that he plans to conquer them as well. The Byzantines reply to say that they are unable to resist and beg him to accept tribute instead. If he could just let him know how many soldiers he has, they will be able to calculate the correct amount. As the tale states, quote, "The Greeks made this proposition to deceive the Rus, for the Greeks are crafty even to the present day." Svyatoslav has 10,000 men, but he tells the Byzantines that he's got 20,000. The Byzantines don't send any tribute, but they do gather an army of 100,000 men. As they approach each other, the Rus are terrified by the enormous Byzantine army, but not Svyatoslav, and he rallies them, quote, "We have no place to which we may flee. Whether we want to or not, we must give battle. We will sacrifice our lives before disgracing Rus and fleeing in dishonor. We shall not take flight, but shall resist boldly. I will march before you, and if I fall, then look for yourselves." "Where your head falls, we too will lay down our own," replied the warriors. End quote. The battle commenced, and once again, the tale says, the carnage was great. Svyatoslav was the victor, and the Byzantines fled. The Rus marched on towards Constantinople, destroying towns that, the tale says, stand deserted to this day. The emperor summoned his councillors to decide how to stop the Rus. The councillors advised that an attempt should be made to buy him off with gifts of gold and silks. So they sent a clever envoy to deliver the gifts and make an assessment. Without bothering to even look at the gifts, Svyatoslav told his servants to take them. On his return, the envoy told the emperor that Svyatoslav didn't even bother to look at the gifts, and the council decided that a second attempt should be made, but with arms instead. The envoy travelled again to Svyatoslav, presenting him with a fine sword and armor. This time, Svyatoslav accepted and admired the gifts, and sent his greetings to the emperor. The councillors said to the emperor, "This man cares nothing for riches, but accepts arms. He must be fierce indeed. Submit to tribute." So the emperor begged Svyatoslav to accept tribute and approach no nearer to Constantinople. Svyatoslav took the tribute, including money to be paid to the families of the Rus who had perished on the campaign, and returned in triumph to Pereyaslav. Many warriors had died on the campaign, and surveying his troops, Svyatoslav became concerned that he was vulnerable to a Byzantine attack. he decided to return to Rus to gather reinforcements. In the meantime, he shared his concerns with his men and sent messengers to the emperor to establish a formal peace treaty. The emperor was also happy to pursue peace, and a treaty was duly concluded. In the treaty, Svyatoslav swore not to attack Byzantium with either the Rus he ruled or foreign mercenaries, not to attack Kherson or Bulgaria, and to aid the Byzantines against their foes. With the peace in place, Svyatoslav followed his plan to return to Rus. He journeyed up the Dnieper by boat as far as the cataracts, where his general, Svyatslav, advised him to go on horseback to avoid nearby Pechenegs. Svyatoslav did not listen and continued by boat. The people of Pereyaslavets sent word to the Pechenegs that he was coming, with the great riches he had received from the Byzantines and the booty from his conquests, but only a few troops. The Pechenegs moved to ambush him at the cataracts, and unable to pass, Svyatoslav was forced to winter at Bielaberg. The Rus had not brought supplies for a winter stay, and food ran short, causing a famine so severe, says the tale, that a horse's head cost half a hryvnia. In the spring, Svyatoslav attempted to pass the cataracts again. Kuria, leader of the Pechenegs, attacked him, killed him, beheaded him, covered his skull in gold, and made it into a drinking cup. And so ended the 28-year reign of Svyatoslav. Unlike the cases of his predecessors, I don't think we need to split our discussion of Svyatoslav into two sections. This part of the tale does not seem to include allegorical or symbolic elements. There's no weird ship burials, bird assassins, or magic numbers. Maybe the monks writing it would have liked to throw some of that stuff in, something to bring out the contrast between Rus' last pagan king and his successors. But unfortunately for them, Svyatoslav seems to have been fairly successful. So instead, we'll be looking at how much this narrative matches what we know of the historical facts. Spoiler alert, the tale leaves out some very important facts, but luckily for us, the Byzantines have recorded them. Two things in particular might have jumped out for you as we went through Svyatoslav's story in the tale. First, that description of him as a mounted warrior always on the move, practically living in the saddle. He sounds like a steppe nomad warrior, right? It's quite a shift from the forest zone lifestyle or Scandinavian fighting on foot. Second, there's that attempt to move from Kiev to Bulgaria. What's that about? We've already discussed Kiev's drawbacks as the capital of Rus, the cataracts that made the Dnieper harder to travel than other rivers, the potential vulnerability of close proximity to the steppe, and we talked in the Olga episode about how Rus and its economy were developing rapidly. In The Emergence of Rus, Simon Franklin and Jonathan Shepard call this a prosperity trap. The Rus trade routes were growing, which enabled and stimulated population growth, which in turn demanded further economic growth. That economic growth could only come from a further expansion of trade, but that expansion was blocked by the physical limits of the routes and the problem of Pecheneg raids, which could block Rus travelers at strategic choke points. They speculate that Olga's unsuccessful trip to Constantinople could have been an attempt to get the Byzantines to take joint responsibility for enforcing free passage conditions along the route south. So, what Olga had failed to do through negotiations and alliances, Svyatoslav tries to do by war. He starts with what in the tale is a blink and you missed it mention of what probably had the most long-term impact on Rus out of everything he did, the attack on the Khazars. The tale allots this just 3 brief sentences. Quote, Svyatoslav sallied forth against the Khazars. When they heard of his approach, they went out to meet him with their prince, the Khan, and the armies came to blows. When the battle thus took place, Svyatoslav defeated the Khazars and took their city of Bielovieja. Hidden behind this brief description, the Rus, in alliance with Orhus Turks, pushing west from the steppe, caused the collapse of the Khazar Khaganate. According to Ibn Horkel, who passed through on his way to Volga, Bulgaria sometime later, there was total devastation. Quote, "The Rus have left nothing to the Bulgar, Bursus, and Khazars but worthless ruins. They fell upon them and looted everything. I asked a man about the vineyards, and he says there is not enough left of a vineyard or garden worth giving to a beggar. If a leaf remained on a branch, one of the Rus would take it. Not a grape, not a raisin remains in the country." End quote. Besides the tale, other records are quite sparse. Obviously, the Khazars' own chronicles are lost. The Byzantines did note what was going on, but don't seem to have attached too much importance to it. Svyatoslav had initially moved to bring the Vyatichians into his kingdom. The Vyatichians were Slavs that had been pushed out of the steppe by the Pechenegs and had moved more east and north to settle in an area that was still controlled by the Khazars, which happened to sit on the trade route from Volga, Bulgaria to Kiev. It may be that by this point the Rus were starting to think that the Slav tribes across the region were, so to speak, theirs, and so they presented a natural starting point for a push against the Khazars. But the main cause was almost certainly an attempt to open a direct route to trade with the Islamic world. This had been becoming more difficult around this time, and those deposits of silver dirhams had started to dry up and would soon disappear completely. It seems a fair assumption that the Rus were aware that the Khazars were vulnerable. It's hard to see how they could have avoided knowing. First, they had taken Kiev and established overlordship over Slav peoples who had been Khazar tributaries. They had close relations with the Volga Bulgars, must have known that they wanted greater independence. The Bulgars, as we heard in the last couple of episodes, were actively developing trade routes that did not involve paying the Khazars. So it was a simple logical step for the Rus to deduce that the Khan was losing the wealth that he needed to pay for his defences. They were well familiar with the Pechenegs and are unlikely to have believed any Khazar claims to authority over them, and they were in contact with the Orhus attempting to move in from the east. The Rus, the Bulgars, and the Orhus were individually all still too weak to tackle the Khazars themselves. But Svyatoslav entered an alliance with the Orhus that meant that they could attack from both sides. The Rus attacked and took the fortress of Sarkel, which may have been the Khazars' last surviving western outpost, as it seems the Pechenegs had already destroyed most of their network of fortresses in the steppe. This gave the Rus control of the valuable trade routes and territory of the Don and Donets valleys. Then they defeated the Kasorgians and Alans, which gave them access to the Kuban, the Caspian and the Black Sea, and down to the Caucasus. These were routes that the Rus had been attempting to develop since the earliest days of the Eastern Road, but where they had had to trade on the terms set by the Khazars. It is not clear that the Rus were actually involved in the attack on the Khazar heartland. They may have been, or it may have been the Orhus who attacked Itil. Whatever the case, the Rus did not establish any control over the Volga at this point. According to Ibn Horkel, Svyatoslav did raid north against the Burtas and the Bulgars. If this happened, and we just don't have enough evidence to tell for sure, it could indicate that the Rus were trying to grab the Bulgars' direct path through to Khwarezm. But if they were not successful. After his campaigns to the east, Svyatoslav looks west. As the tale says, quote, Svyatoslav marched to the Danube to attack the Bulgarians. End quote. It didn't quite happen like this. For the whole of the rest of his life, basically, the tale essentially leaves out nearly all the key points. The Western campaign actually began with the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus Phocas sending Kalakairos, the strategos of Kherson, to make Svyatoslav an offer of £1,500 of gold and any loot he could carry off if he would attack the Bulgarians. The motivation for this offer is not entirely clear, but historians believe it was to punish the Bulgarians for allowing the Magyars to raid Roman territory. Svyatoslav accepts the imperial mission, but then he throws a spanner in the works for the emperor by deciding that he actually likes it better on the Danube, so why not stay? More Byzantine intrigues may have been going on behind the scenes here, as some historians believe that Kalakairos encouraged the Rus to settle on the Danube as part of his own plans to attempt to take the throne. While this may be true, the actual reasoning the tale attributes to Svyatoslav when he declares his wish to move south is entirely based on economic considerations that are remarkably consistent with the entire development of Rus, and therefore I think we can probably accept them as accurate. The Danube trade routes were not as well developed as those further east and had been interrupted by the arrival of the Magyars. But the Germans had recently defeated the Magyars and trade was flowing again. It's also quite possible that the Rus merchants operating on the routes west from Kiev were already getting involved in the Danube trade. The Byzantines react to their new unwanted neighbors by bribing the Pechenegs to attack Kiev, which succeeds in making Svyatoslav return home for a year. The siege of Kiev has a few interesting points to note. First, it's not really clear that the Rus on the other side of the river are under Kiev's rule. We've already noted that it's not clear that Kiev controlled Chernihiv at this time, and geographically it's quite possible that the Rus on the other side of the river are the men of Chernihiv who had not joined in with Svyatoslav's campaign. They arrive at the river, but do not immediately attempt to relieve Kiev. Maybe they are just there to see what's going on, whether the Pechenegs are really interested in switching from raiding to a full-scale attack on Rus, or to try to deter them from entering their territory. We can also see that Olga asks them for assistance rather than commanding them to attack the Pechenegs. The story of the heroic boy who takes the request for help across to the gathered Rus is also indicative. The fact that boys in Kiev might speak fluent Pecheneg and be familiar enough with them to pass themselves off with Pecheneg on a nighttime stroll through their camp is presented in a fairly matter-of-fact way. Communications between the Rus and the Pechenegs are generally presented as easy. And when Svyatoslav returns to drive them off, they conclude an agreement with the exchange of gifts that also draws no surprise. We can see that the Rus and the Pechenegs seem to be well accustomed to dealing with each other. While Svyatoslav is at home, Olga speaks against the move to Pereyaslavets, but dies shortly after. Without her as the natural regent to leave behind to administer his affairs, Svyatoslav is forced to make other arrangements and decides to assign his sons to different cities. This starts a tradition that is going to cause endless problems for the rest of the existence of Rus. All the evidence points to the new campaign into Bulgaria being a purposeful attempt to settle. Svyatoslav's warriors brought their families with them. He immediately sets out to nip any Bulgarian resistance in the bud by impaling 20,000 captives outside Philippolis, a detail the tale omits for some reason. The number is probably exaggerated, but it's certain that there was a large-scale slaughter. He combines this with allowing Boris I to remain as a figurehead emperor in Preslav, the Bulgarian capital, so the cowed Bulgarians could see him as their protector. The Byzantine chroniclers agree with the tale that after this Svyatoslav wanted to conquer Constantinople, or at least take some of its European provinces. But it seems improbable that he had any genuine plans to take on the Theodosian walls. By this point, Nikephoros' focus was gone, replaced by John Tzimiskes, who had conspired with Nikephoros' wife to assassinate him in revenge for a slight. Tzimiskes had distinguished himself in campaigns against the Arabs and had a reputation as an outstanding general. The Byzantines marched on Bulgaria, sacked Preslav after defeating its Rus garrison, and captured the Bulgarian royal family. The Byzantines then marched on towards Svyatoslav, who came to meet them. The Byzantine records agree with the tale that there was a great battle with neither able to prevail until the Pechenegs and Magyars abandoned the Rus. The chronicles do not clarify, but it is probable that the Byzantines had succeeded in buying them off. With his forces reduced, Svyatoslav retreated to Drista, where he withstood the Byzantine siege for months and successfully repelled all attacks. Frustrated, Tzimiskes offered to resolve the conflict through single combat, but Svyatoslav declined. As the weeks passed without a resolution, Svyatoslav sent messengers to the Byzantines offering to release his prisoners and return to the Dnieper in exchange for safe conduct and the reconfirmation of Rus trading rights in Constantinople. The emperor agreed to the proposal, and the two of them met, as equals, without victor or vanquished, to conclude the treaty described in the tale. The Byzantine chronicles record the meeting, describing Svyatoslav in similar terms to the tale of bygone years. He was of average height and dressed in steppe style. His clothing was high-quality fabric, but otherwise plain and unadorned. He did not rise to greet the emperor or show him any signs of deference. This was not a surrender, it was a peace agreement. The Byzantine chroniclers are generally impressed with the Rus, providing positive portrayals of the Rus commander of Preslav as well as Svyatoslav, and recognizing their military capabilities. After the departure of the Rus, Tzimiskes is unsure whether Svyatoslav would honor the agreement, so he sends word to the Pechenegs that he is returning to Kiev with a small force and much treasure, resulting in the ambush on the Dnieper, the death of Svyatoslav, and the end of any plans for the Rus to move on to the Danube. Svyatoslav's rule marks a radical change in Rus power. His campaigns are not conducted by a cobbled-together loose alliance of Rus, Slavs, Finno-Ugrians, Balts, and anyone else willing to join in, taking a straight route south to where they know the treasure is. If we draw a line on the map around the territory of his campaigns, the circle has a circumference of 8,000 kilometers. He covers an enormous range. He is generally very successful, and from the comments attributed to him in the tale and Byzantine chronicles, we can clearly discern that he had well thought out objectives. No other Rus leader will be so successful in combat against steppe forces, or indeed against the Byzantines. How was this achieved? First, most obviously, as we can see from the description of Svyatoslav himself, he and his družina seem to have created a successful fusion of Scandinavian and steppe fighting styles. We have early references to the Rus struggling with cavalry, but here we can see that his armies are highly mobile and rapidly cover enormous distances. Even if the Rus are relying on steppe allies to do much of the fighting, they would need to have a certain level of competence to make their alliance effective, and it was in fact sufficient to defeat serious rivals like the Khazars, Bulgars, Alans, and Bulgarians. The fact that a large part of Svyatoslav's armies were nomad mercenaries does not refute the idea that the Rus had also become capable of applying steppe tactics, as the contemporary sources are clear that the Rus were the core, and in any case, the armies would not have been able to operate with that speed and effectiveness if the Rus were unable to keep up. This also does not mean that the Rus had forgotten or abandoned their more traditional Scandinavian style of fighting. The Byzantine accounts of battles in the extended siege of Priska described the Rus fighting on foot and forming an impregnable shield wall. At that meeting between Kritic and the leader of Pechenegs, Kritic gives him a Scandinavian-style sword and a shield, and the Pecheneg gives a steppe-style spear, sabre, and arrows back to him. According to the Byzantine chronicler Leo the Deacon, some of the Rus would roar and behave like wild animals during battle. In other words, they were berserked. And we can still see Scandinavian names like Sveinord and Asmund amongst Svyatoslav's commanders. The blending of Scandinavian and steppe warrior styles by the družinas of the time is reflected in burial goods. Archaeologists have found Scandinavian-style graves that contain sabres, Magyar-style arrows, and scabbards, sometimes combining steppe-style decorations with the Rus falcon. Some graves combine typical Scandinavian grave goods, an axe, sword, scaramouche, with horse sacrifices. Many graves have been found around Kiev and Chernihiv containing these mixed articles, not only their combination of double-edged sword and axes with composite bows and horses, but also Scandinavian swords with Magyar decorations and composite bows with Scandinavian motifs. The material culture and the well-attested transition from close formation infantry fighting to cavalry shows that steppe warriors were almost certainly a part of a knyaz's retinue from the 10th century. The Rus also joined the steppe peoples, perhaps in smaller numbers. Svyatoslav's son Yaropolk had some trouble with a Pecheneg leader called Varazhko, or the Varangian. How did Svyatoslav succeed in combining these forces? If you think back to the episodes on the early adventures, Scandinavians in the East, we talked about how much of their cultural worldview could have overlapped. Scandinavians and steppe peoples both cultivated warrior ideals and created group identities through oaths, feasting, and reciting poems about heroes. Exchanges of weapons between leaders agreeing peace also fits with Scandinavian and steppe practices of giving binding oaths. Contemporary writers particularly note that never fleeing battle was an especially honoured ideal among the Rus, as we heard in the summary at the beginning of this episode as Svyatoslav spoke to his men. Anyone who could display this and the other ideal behaviours could be accepted among the warrior elite. We see this in the proliferation of Slavic names appearing in successive treaties with Byzantium, and in the Turkic grave goods of warrior graves in Rus cities. We can imagine that, like Svyatoslav himself, much of his druzhina dressed steppe style, in kaftans with conical hats and helmets. They carried composite bows, ornate steppe belt fittings, and saber-tashes, a kind of small bag hung next to the sword, as well as carrying straight, double-edged swords and axes, practicing cremation, using drinking horns, and playing the Scandinavian board games found in their graves. Svyatoslav embodied this fusion of the forest and steppe, combining Scandinavian descent, Slavic name, Magyar hairstyle, shaved at the back and sides and tied up into a ponytail, and wearing steppe earrings. He kept Scandinavian men like Sveinord and Asmund beside him, but he lived a nomadic horseback life. So how should we assess Svyatoslav? Svyatoslav stands out among the other Rus rulers. He's not like those who came before or those who came after him. There's a slight sense that the chroniclers don't quite know what to do with him. By the logic of previous entries, he should be used to illustrate the folly of rejecting God, but unfortunately he was too successful to provide the material. He was clearly more than just a charismatic war leader. He's not campaigning just for the sake of it and not simply expanding his territory. His campaigns against the Khazars and the Bulgarians are both motivated by the considerations that have driven the Rus so far, establishing elite control over a local population and dominating trade. His reasoning is clearly articulated in the tale, even if the chronicler did not fully recognize it. He does not say he wants to conquer and move to Bulgaria for glory, or to expand his realm, or to exact tribute from more people. He says that he wants to be at the center of the trade flows from which he derives his wealth. When he negotiates a peace with Tzimiskis, the condition that he insists on is the Rus retaining their trade privileges in Constantinople. And this is not to downplay his military achievements. All of the peoples he defeats are significant foes, from the Khazars to the Alans in the North Caucasus, still highly formidable to the Bulgarians. In the armies led by Tzimiskis, he was fighting peak Byzantium led by one of its great generals, one recently ranked among the top 10 emperors by Anthony Kaldilis on the History of Byzantium podcast. His reign had significant long-term impact. Russian historiography often describes an eternal war between the forest and the steppe, from which our first season takes its name. But this was not true for the early stages of Rus development. As we've heard, while not entirely violence-free, it was more of a meeting in which the peoples of the forest and steppe interacted, merged, and drove the development of each other. But with the loss of the Khazar bulwark, there would now be successive waves of invasion, finally culminating in the Mongols. The fusion of steppe and forest seen in the 10th century drujinas and in Svyatoslav's combination of steppe and Rus styles will not develop into something bigger as the steppe comes to be seen as the enemy. There was long-term impact for others too. Bulgar vulnerability to steppe incursions also increased the loss of the Khazars on their southern flank, and they too would suffer from waves of invaders. If you listened to the interview with Monica White, you'll recall that I asked her about Byzantine intelligence activities and whether they had a plan. Her opinion was that they didn't. The Rus were too far away for them to maintain detailed knowledge, and they just threw out everything they could, bribes, trade, cultural superiority, to try and keep them away from Byzantine territory, without ever having a real, properly thought-out plan. I was particularly thinking about the events we've been discussing today when I asked that question. We can see the lack of planning here. The Byzantines apparently had no response and did not foresee any trouble with the fall of the Khazars. Perhaps a bit surprising given that they had all their records from the age of migration when Byzantine territory had been constantly invaded. They paid the Rus to attack the Bulgarians, clearly without any idea of what would happen if the Rus was successful, and they must have had a fit when Svyatoslav told them that he decided to stay and maybe he'd grab some more of their territory too. Then they paid the Pechenegs to attack Kiev, which resulted in a treaty between the Rus and the Pechenegs that made Svyatoslav even stronger. Betraying Svyatoslav to his death ended that threat, but with Bulgaria in chaos, Byzantium was forced to annex it. In the event, this worked out for them due to Tzimiskis' general competence. But there's a whiff of panic around all those bribes to one party after another. Really looks like they were just winging it and hoping it would work out. For me, Svyatoslav is an intriguing figure that I would like to know more about. How did someone supposedly raised by his Rus uncle Dobrynya, his sainted grandmother, and Scandinavian retainers end up a staunch pagan going around with a Magyar haircut, sleeping on a horse blanket in the middle of nowhere like some nomad warrior? Was he fostered with a steppe ruler? Was there a particularly influential Turkic retainer in his druzhina? There's no clue in the evidence we have, it's simply presented as a fact. So, Svyatoslav remains something of a mystery, a glimpse of a different kind of Rus that could have appeared in a world where the Byzantines did not treacherously go to the Pechenegs to betray him. Rus where there was a Turkic-Slavic alliance forming a state further south on the steppe and on the Danube. But instead, the Rus were about to rise to their greatest period, back in Kiev, on the Dnieper. And with Svyatoslav's sons, we were entering on a period of greater information. because that illegitimate son, Vladimir, that he put in charge of Novgorod, will become the man who will unite and consolidate Rus, lead its conversion to Christianity, and usher in its golden age. But before we turn to his rise to power, the next episode will look at not so much the legacy of the Khazars, maybe afterlife is a better word, a strange, and I think, for most of you, unexpected tale, including the origins of the Jewish people, mystical theories of ethnogenesis, Eurasianism, conspiracy theories featuring Boris Yeltsin, and Vladimir Putin's worldview. It will be quite a long episode, and I'm starting a new job, so if it's a few days late, you know why. Before that, there will be a new members episode out, and with us between the conversion of the Bulgars and the conversion of the Rus, it seems like a good time to revisit religion on the steppe and look at the arrival of Manichaeism and Christianity. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.